It's kind of funny. When the 7800X 3D came out, it was the GOAT, right? It just stomped all over Intel's 13900K and just absolutely became the gaming CPU meta. If you didn't have it, you're a loser and you're a fanboy of Intel or something. Then the 9800X 3D came out and it was like, oh my God, it's a new GOAT. It is so much faster, it is so much better. If you don't have it, you're a loser and you're just an Intel fanboy. The 9850X 3D came out and everyone went, ugh. What? Looking at the responses and the viewer feedback of not just our 9850X 3D video, whereas again, we're just seeking advice from you guys on what you want to see on these types of reviews, but very established review channels that have obviously got their SOPs and stuff very much in place. If you look at the view counts on those videos versus like when the 9800X 3D first came out, it basically told us no one gives a flying fuck about it. And I think part of the reason for that is because the 9850X 3D launch was right on the heels of CES, where AMD basically said, we don't give a flying fuck about you consumers anymore. It's probably safe to make this video, because typically if you said anything about AMD that wasn't absolutely shaking your AMD red team pom-poms, then you'd basically have a mob coming after you with torches and pitchforks talking about how you're just an Intel fanboy or an Nvidia fanboy, depending on the argument. But I feel like that sentiment is dying off rather quickly because AMD seems to be kind of losing its way when it comes to what its focus is, what its future is going to be versus what its past has been since 2016 when like the Ryzen architecture launched. So it's funny because the evidence is just in the launch cycles, the planned roadmap, and obviously the things that they've showed. So for instance, if you didn't watch any of the CES content, we didn't really make any because we didn't go, but if you watch anyone else's out there, it was big snooze fest. It was just an AI circle jerk, and it was just one company boasting and showing off another company on their stage. Like, I'm sorry, but if you go to an Intel keynote, you want to hear from Intel. You don't want to hear about some freaking legislature shit they're going to bring out. Same thing with Nvidia. You go to Nvidia keynote, you want to hear about what Nvidia is doing, not I'm going to bring out some other senator politician guy that's paving the way for you to just do some nefarious things. And AMD sort of does the same thing. Like, here's the AI stuff we're interested in, and here's who we're partnering with to do it. And it's like no one in this sphere gives two shits about that. In fact, it kind of just proves that AMD absolutely is now just following suit with, sorry, I'm distracted by a husky hair floating in the air right now. I did take my dog to the vet today, and anyone that has a husky knows that if you live in the same city as a husky, you get husky hair on you. So anyway, I can see it. That's why I'm fuzzy. Let's talk about AMD's launch history, even just the last couple generations of CPU and GPU versus what we just saw in its most recent launch cycle and the gaps in between there. So if we go back to, let's just go to 2024 till now. In 2024, CPUs that AMD launched was the 9950X, the 9900X, the 7900X, the 9600X, the 5900 XT, and the 5800 XT, and the 9800X 3D. All of those in one year. In the same year, I should say. For GPUs, in 2024, January, they launched the 7600 XT 16GB GDDR6 and the 7900 GRE. But if we talk about all the GPUs they launched between the end of 22, like the very, very end, and through all of 23, that also includes the 7900 XTX, the 7900 XT, I already said 7900 GRE, 7800 XT, 7700 XT, 7600 XT, and the 7600. Now, although they weren't necessarily adopted anywhere near the rate NVIDIA GPUs were adopted, they were getting a pretty solid adoption rate. In fact, there's a while there we were even doing videos like, why are people sleeping on the AMD GPU offerings when you couldn't buy NVIDIA GPUs post-COVID and all that because the shortages were still lasting through 22 and even parts of 23. The 7900 XTX was super solid. I mean, 24 gigabytes of VRAM. Obviously, it was super fast. It was on par with like a 4080, which nobody needs a 90 tier GPU at all. They don't need that. The 80 series is about all you would need, or 80 tier, and 7900 XTX traded blows with that. In fact, even outperformed it in many games because certain engines would favor maybe one architecture over another. But I digress. Let's talk about CPUs that launched in 2025. The 9950X3D and the 9900X3D. It's kind of like they blew their whole load, demonetized, in 2024. And then they kind of like rounded the bend and in March launched the 9950X3D and 9900X3D. So we went all of 2025 with no like refresh or bump or 50s. What I mean by that is we've seen in the past like the 5950X CPU or the XT every now and then, right? But that means they were working on architecture improvements. So the only architecture bump we've seen so far was the 9850X3D, which I just showed you guys. As you can see by the view counts, no one really gave a flying F about it. This 9700X and the 9600X was an interesting one because with that review, that was where people started to kind of get upset with AMD because of the fact that was when AMD really tried to focus on, let's make it max out at like, I think it was 80 watts or something crazy like that. So what they saw was literally no gain in performance whatsoever because AMD really went into the performance per watt. So even though there was an architecture bump where things were better architecturally, it didn't get any faster on paper or in tangible performance because they limited the power. So then they came out with a 105 watt mode, which bumped up some of that performance, but it was kind of like a little bit too late. Like people really sort of didn't care. Same sort of thing when it comes to the X3D stuff. Like the 9800 X3D was overclockable, and we actually saw tangible overclockable improvements with that. We saw, like I said, my GPU or my CPU just doesn't overclock well. The 9800 X3D, mine personally doesn't, but I've seen other folks say they get 5.5, 5.6 all day long on it, essentially making them, they have a 9850 X3D at that point. 7800 X3D and the 7900 and 7950 X3Ds also technically had overclocking unlocked. And what I mean by that is like you could turn on PBO and stuff, but nothing happened. Like physically nothing would happen. It would just run no matter what at the dedicated speeds that were listed on the spec sheet, which is kind of exactly what we saw with the 9850 X3D. It's almost like the buttons are there, but they don't do anything. Because remember how I showed how even at the max clock speed that our BIOS was showing, it never went up from 5650? It's kind of like it's there, but because it's on the ragged edge probably of what's stable out of the box, they just don't really allow it to lift. Maybe there's some other voltage reasons and some other sensitivities we're not aware of. It's like even though the button is there, it doesn't do anything. Let's talk about GPUs that launched in 2025. The 9070 XT, the 9070, and the 9060 XT. And with quote, whatever, not hashtags, but asterisks. The 9060, but it wasn't a retail card, it was an OEM only card. So like Dell, HP, Alienware, I don't know if Alienware had those, but anyway, you couldn't just go to the shelf and buy them, they were for like OEM use only. 3 GPUs have launched since when of 24? Because I have this noted right here. Since January of 2024. We are now in February of 2026. We've gotten 3 GPUs from AMD. It's too bad too, because we've already seen the 9070 XT's strengths on their GPU chiplet design. And considering the fact that their CPU lineup has performed as well as it has because of the maturation of the whole substrate, the Infinity Fabric, and actually allowing themselves to have a scalable design all the way up to the 9995 WX96 core CPU. They could do the same thing with GPUs, but they just basically were like, we're not interested. We don't want to do any of that. I'm wondering now if this was the lead-in to them knowing AI was going to be their shift going forward, where all of that silicon might be necessary for them to kind of try and develop their own AI product. Obviously, they're nowhere near on par to compete with Nvidia. Nvidia has been dumping hundreds of billions of dollars over the last few years into AI, where as far as I can find, because here's the problem, when it comes to, I was trying to validate a lot of this by saying, follow the money. Right? And following the money and where people spend their R&D and where they spend in their investments is where you know what their intentions are. AMD has not really been having a huge bump in R&D spend over the last 3 years. And they also don't break it out specifically that says this is R&D for this and this is R&D for AI. It's just kind of all lumped into an R&D spend. But from 2022 to 2024, AMD spent about $17 billion in R&D. That includes AI. That's not a lot. Like I say, it's not a lot because that's over 3 years. If you compare that to what Nvidia has spent, it is like, that's like a Jensen luncheon for whatever pandering he's doing to politicians, right? To get all of his crazy incentives, right? To work with the government and Palantir and all this other crap on this sort of stuff. In 2025, the reports aren't finalized, like the earnings reports aren't finalized yet for AMD. It shows that they spend about 7.4 billion in 25 alone. So if you look at like, that's an uptrend, not a huge uptrend, but that just makes me feel like they clearly are not focusing on consumers nearly as much. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if their HPDT, high performance desktop, and EPYC CPUs for these data centers isn't where like AMD is really kind of like filling a gap right there. A lot of these data centers are like, okay, we have racks and racks of GPUs, we need some CPU in there as well. I wouldn't be surprised if AMD has these major contracts that are just about CPU sales. And I don't know what's happening with the GPU side of it, but the fact that they absolutely could have by now, in my opinion, with how fast they moved on some of these products when it comes to consumer grade stuff that we've seen since 2022, I would be shocked if they hadn't even considered how excited we all were about 9070 XT. The fact that for a mid-tier GPU to be trading blows with a 5080 on many titles just showed its strengths and its scalability, that they wouldn't have even by now even rumored, teased, or even considered making like a 9090 XT or something like that. Like, I don't know how hard that would have honestly been. I mean, truly, they've already showed scalability of chiplet is kind of easy for them. Unless they just knew that this storm was coming when it comes to the VRAM shortages and the DRAM shortages and the extreme buying frenzy that's been happening when it comes to AI. So this is where I'm kind of just making this video to sort of throw it out there. I'm curious because the YouTube crowd has been so vocal as AMD, with AMD pride, because not because I think people truly bought in and loved AMD. It was the other guy, right? If you were like, fuck Intel and fuck Nvidia, what are you left with? AMD, yay, let's go. So I'm wondering now if people are feeling slighted, if people are feeling used, or perhaps even just maybe the honeymoon's worn off on the whole AMD is so good. Because I've been saying this all along, especially to the biggest AMD fanboys. They're not your friend. They don't love and care about you like you care about them. They truly don't. They are for profit, like any other major company out there. And I'm not saying for profit is bad. It's not. If companies were not for profit, nothing you have and we have would even really exist, okay? We're talking about now social economics that I'm not gonna get into, but I'm just saying, for profit is not a bad thing. Just like capitalism is not a bad thing. But both of those things can be bastardized and abused and weaponized in ways that are bad, right? I don't ever believe AMD was truly your friend. I think AMD was just enjoying that meteoric rise, right? To no pun intended, to the Ryzen architecture and Lisa Su's return and AMD's triumphant return from nearly the depths of bankruptcy and obscurity. And here they are, now just riding the coattails and basically gobbling up the leftovers that Nvidia is leaving behind. So I'm curious, is the dedicated fan base of AMD dying down? Because to me, that doesn't leave a whole lot of options out there anymore, right? We're never gonna stop making PC content as long as PC's around. And even if like somehow the PC as we know it changes, we'll have to change too, but we'll also always just enjoy and talk about and recreate the glory days, which is why so many of you have been enjoying like the retro content when we were doing it. It's never going anywhere, but man, if it doesn't make new adoption hard. So I'm curious, try to actually think about your response before you write it. Really just sort of try to reminisce a little bit and then decide, like, do you feel like AMD is also saying F you to the average consumer and the gamer in exchange for, we'll take all the AI dollars we can get? We know it's not real money right now. The question is how long before AMD figures that out?